My intention today is to give you a bit of information about the research that I've done so far and about conserving pollinators in your garden or your allotment. My area of research is focused on pollinator conservation in the urban environment. My intention today is not to give you a list of plants that conserve pollinators, because those lists are already really widely available. They're really, really good. They can be quite variable depending on what sort of species they're looking at, whether it's bees or butterflies, but there's loads of lists out there, so I'm not going to just give you a list of plants. These are our pollinators. We've got our single honeybee, which I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with. We've got about between 24 and 26, depending on the year, species of bumblebees. And then we have nearly 2,500 species of solitary bee, and many of these species, they vary between 3 and 15 millimetres. Some of them just look like flies, others look like flying ants, so it can be quite difficult to recognise them in the garden. But I'll show you a few different pictures of some of the species. They're quite variable, but hopefully give you a chance to recognise them, and maybe later on if you see them in your garden you know what they are. Many species of butterfly moth. We've got about 20 species of butterfly which frequent gardens, and those are the 20 species that I'm going to focus on today. Many species of moth. We've also got a lot of flower pollinating beetles, and many species of hoverfly. So bees are probably our most important pollinator. They can pollinate a range of different flower shapes and types. If you imagine the honeybee to be sort of the standard pollinator, the standard bee pollinator, they tend to go for flowers which are like daisies. They're quite open, they're easy to access the pollen and nectar inside. Bumblebees are bigger, they're sort of rotund, stronger insects, so they can prise apart the lips of larger flowers. They also have, this is a garden bumblebee, its tongue is extremely long, much longer than honeybees, so it can pollinate plants which have long corollas like this, bellflower. So bumblebees can pollinate a much wider variety of different species of plant. Solitary bees, because they vary quite dramatically in size, they'll also pollinate a slightly different array of plants, but I'm going to go through later and show you which sorts of plants they prefer and which sort of flower shapes they prefer. So when we talk about conserving pollinators in general, not just in your garden, we need to consider what resources the pollinators they actually need, and this varies depending on the species. Now here I'm focusing on butterflies and bees, just because the types of conservation practice we apply to help these species will also help many of the other pollinators we just saw. So for butterflies, the two most important aspects are the host plant, which is what the butterfly will lay its eggs on and which the caterpillar will consume. This is the most important resource the butterflies need. If you want butterflies in or around your garden, it's really important to have the host plant in the vicinity, because they don't normally travel very far for a nectar resource. Most of the adult lifetime is spent looking for a mate, so many butterflies don't actually visit flowers at all, so that's why you might see them in your garden but never actually see them land. But when they do want to sort of quench their thirst, they're looking for nectar-rich species, and we're going to have a look at some of those. So bees, they're looking for quite a few more extra resources. Nectar and pollen in the plants that they visit, and we lump these together and we call these the floral resource, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. They're also looking for a nest site and nesting materials. Now this is not so applicable to the honeybee because we provide that for them, but for solitary bees, for instance, they'll be picking up, they'll either cut pieces of leaf, or they'll collect sort of mud or sand, and they'll pack these together into their nesting pods. Bumblebees will be looking for disused burrows. That's where they mostly, those are the sites that they go for to lay their brood. So if we look at all of these resources together, what we try to do in non-urban environments is create a habitat that contains all of these and put them together. And that allows us to conserve these species, not just in a single, maybe the adult stage of their lifetime by providing flowers, but providing everything they need throughout their whole life cycle. So I'm going to go through each of these and show you how this is applicable to your garden or your allotment. So nesting resources for bees. I'm going to focus on solitary bees for this one because they're the lesser known bee. So there are many different species of solitary bee, and each one is looking for something slightly different to put their nest. This is a cross section of a nest. So the solitary bee will crawl inside. It will lay an egg, and it will have a breeding pod, and it will lay many eggs. And the substance in between, in this case, it's mud or some sort of earth substrate in which it packs together. And inside there also are provision of pollen and nectar substrate, all mulched up, ready for the larvae to consume when it hatches. The leafcutter bee, instead of using, this is probably a leafcutter bee pod here, these are a different species, but you can see the green where they've cut up leaves. And you might recognise that shape in maybe some of your rose bushes, and that's absolutely fine. They're not doing any harm to the plant. That's a solitary bee, that's a leafcutter bee, mulching up the leaves and packing it in for its brood. There's another solitary bee. This is a wool carder bee, and it looks a bit like a wasp. But if you ever see something that looks like a cross between a wasp and a bee, it's probably a wool carder bee. And the plant that they absolutely love, and this is one plant I can tell you that will encourage these, is lamb's ears. And they are great for the pollen and nectar, but what this bee is doing, this is a female, she sit there, if you've seen lamb's ears, they have sort of a downy fur on the stems and on the leaves, and she'll sit and she'll scratch up until she's got a ball, and then she will use that to package up her nest. That's what a bumblebee nest looks like. If you haven't seen one, it's you're more likely to uncover something like that so towards the end of the year. But they're looking, as I said before, for disused burrows. That's why they quite often say if you're trying to make if you use a pot or whether you buy a bumblebee box, if you're trying to make a bumblebee nest box from scratch, that's why they say put materials in there, whether it's sort of hay. We don't normally suggest shavings, but if you've come across any bird nests or disused rodent burrows that you've uncovered when you're doing your gardening, save the material and use it inside. You can take a flower pot, turn it upside down, put the material inside and submerge it half into the earth. And then if you get a length of hose pipe and trail it from the inside of the pot out to the surface so that it's flat against the surface of the soil, that would be an ideal bumblebee home, and that's a really cheap and easy way to do it. And if you monitor them through the spring, so the first bumblebee queens will be coming out this month, buff-tailed and white-tailed bumblebees are coming out this month, so they'll be looking for nest sites like that, so you can easily set those up ready for the queens. These nesting structures, these are solitary bee houses. These are different from a bug stack, which is what you'd expect to see. Maybe if you've seen the pallets being stacked on top of each other, this is a bug stack, so the intention is to keep it moist for all the creepy crawlies inside. A solitary bee house should be in full sun and should be put in a place where it's going to dry out quickly because they need to keep the brood dry inside. I would say about solitary bee houses is that this picture was taken of a bee house where there's a piece of flat wood that has been placed over the other side, and they've just removed it so you can see what's inside. You may see solitary bee houses that are either made out of glass or plastic, and it's almost like a test tube, and this is for a visual educational purpose so you can see what's happening inside, or you may just have some plexiglass over the front of that. There are some issues with this design because the glass and the plastic, they tend to heat up quite quickly, and so you can get molds growing inside the brood. Oh, this is just to illustrate that you can use all different types of wood. You can use wooden blocks, or you can use bamboo canes or hogweed or sunflower canes, doesn't matter, and the holes don't necessarily need to be perfectly circular. But you need to, if you want to try and make one of these yourself, they're really good because you can have a go at lots of different designs and pick whichever one you like. But the holes have to be deep enough so that you don't have a strong temperature gradient inside. Because if it's too warm, you'll get a sex-skewed ratio of the offspring being all male. And you don't want it to be too warm, you want a mix of males and females. I do have, if anybody is interested in making a solitary bee house, I do have measurements. They might be somewhere in the presentation, I can't remember now. But I do have the measurements if anybody would like to know. There has been a few pieces of research been done on this, and there are measurements which have been shown to encourage the most number of occupancy rates in these nests. So for butterflies, butterflies are a bit tricky with wildlife gardening because many of the species they are specialists, which means that there is only one plant that they'll lay their eggs on, only one plant that the caterpillar will eat. Normally with the floral resource in terms of collecting nectar, they're not so fussy, but the most important thing is the host plant. So there are 60 species of butterfly in Britain. About 20 of those you might see in your gardens. So to encourage butterflies in your gardens, it's probably best to just have a look at the context of your garden or your allotment and just think about what you actually have in there. If you have an allotment or a garden that's filled with stinging, or you have stinging nettles everywhere, or thistles, then your best bet is to try and encourage vanessid butterflies, which is your really iconic British species, your red admiral, your peacock, your comma, and these are the species which you would quite often see feasting on buddleia in the middle towards the end of the summer. If maybe your garden is near agricultural land and you've got lots of grass species, and the grasses can grow so that you've got the fluorescence on top, so you've got the flowers on top if they're allowed to grow long, or if you have a mini meadow in your garden, your best bet is you might see the brown species, so your meadow brown, your ringlet, those sorts of species. The blue butterflies are rarer to see in gardens. These are the species that tend to be the most specialist. So for example, Adonis blue butterflies, they only lay their eggs on bird's foot trefoil. But you can try and encourage them in your gardens. It's a little bit harder than trying to encourage bees that are more generalistic. But you can have a go. There's some blue butterflies, as I say, only on bird's foot trefoil. Some of them are only on sorrel, so common sorrel or sheep sorrel, and some of them only on holly or only on ivy, so they're a lot more particular. So if you do see a blue butterfly in your garden, have a quick look around, see what you have, see where it might be landing, and especially look out for the caterpillars as well. I'm going to give you an example of white butterfly conservation in a minute, but white butterflies, they quite often found on outdoor purging buckthorn. Otherwise, you can garden for them quite easily by growing vegetables. Now, I'm pretty useless in this respect because if I grow a vegetable garden and I see a caterpillar on one of my cabbages, I think, well, you probably need it more than I do, so I just let them get on with it. By the end of the season, I don't actually have anything to show for a vegetable patch. But if you have a space in your garden, you want to do something a little bit different with it. I realise this probably doesn't apply to many people who have allotments who are using it for a product at the end. But it's a bit unusual, so you don't have to have a cabbage. There's garlic mustard, there's other species. I'll show you a bit more in a minute, but there are other species that you can, unusual ones that you can put into your garden that might be utilised as a host plant. And it's really important to make sure you have enough of them. So butterflies they're very difficult to conserve because when they're picking a site to lay their eggs, there might be 10 metres of stinging nettles all in a row, but only one of those leaves on one plant may be in the exact right positioning in the sun and for them to lay their eggs. So it's quite tricky to conserve butterflies. But if you see them, then it's a good idea just to have a think about what it is in your garden that they might be using. If you see caterpillars, then maybe just leave a few nettles in the back of if you've got your garden to stand. Okay, but there are alternatives. If you don't like the sort of wild long grass thistle nettle look, there are alternatives: holly, buckthorn. So if you think about floral resources in three different aspects, the first is that there's pollen and nectar in flowers, which is really important for pollinators, but that's just one aspect. And within the pollen and nectar, there are lots of different nutrients which these pollinators need to improve their health and maintain a resistance to diseases. But there's also the consideration of gene flow. Now, to maintain a healthy population of any species, there needs to be a high genetic diversity, which means that they can adapt to changes in their environment. Now, if all of the habitats are isolated, if you have pockets, and say there's a pocket of agricultural area, a pocket of urban green space, then the likelihood that a pollinator is going to travel from one all the way to the other with no stops in between is very unlikely. So to encourage the spread of pollinators all through the urban environment and other environments, we need to create these species-rich plots in our gardens and on our allotments to encourage a movement across the entire landscape. So in a very broad sense, that's why the flora resource is important. And if you wanted to take that down to garden level, you could say, you could have a look in your neighbour's garden, and if they have a particular species of poppy or whatever it happens to be, you might consider planting the same thing in your garden so that there's a continuous strip, because some pollinators, they don't want to visit lots of different plants. They actually like a mass of one species. So for bees then, spring plants that are in flower now or this month and next month are as important, if not more important, than all the species which flower during the summer. So I've put a few examples there, but you're looking at accommodating queen bees that are coming out of hibernation, and these queens are setting up their nests, and you'll have quite a lot of mining bees come out at this time. As I said before, buff and whitetail, this is a whitetail bumblebee queen, they're coming out this month, and the first solitary bees will emerge next month. So it's really important to have something in your garden. The very best thing is to have spring blossoming fruit trees. So you've got your apple, cherry, plum, pear. And a really popular species is willows, so salix species. So this gives them the opportunity to collect lots of pollen and nectar and provision that for their brood when they start to have baby bees. So in the summer, these are probably the species that you're much more familiar with planting. These species are ones that they're either wildflowers that you can plant, that you can grow from seed, or they're plants that you can get from the garden centre. Doesn't really make much of a difference. If you've got a flower which is quite open, so say a daisy or a clover or whatever it happens to be, it's always a good sign. If you're at a garden centre, it's always a good sign if you can actually see pollen and nectar on the plant. If you can see sort of a dusting, so here the dusting is actually coming off on the bees. If you can see that on the plant, you know it's pretty much going to be almost definitely useful to at least one pollinating species. Okay. It's a bit more tricky with plants like foxglove, where you can't actually see inside. But as a general rule, open flowers are good for pollinators, and I'll come back to flower shape in a minute. So to give you some examples of some solitary bees, as I said before, they're very variable. And you've got, most solitary bees are generalists, like all bees. Some of them have specific plants that they look for either as a nesting resource as well as a pollen and nectar resource, or just because that particular plant is available at the time of year that they emerge. So for example, this is the ivy mining bee. This is probably the last solitary bee that you will have seen in your garden at the very end of the year. It looks like a wasp, but it will only feed on ivy. That's the only place you're going to see it. The lamb's ear, the wool-carded bee, as I said before, looks a bit like a wasp. But as you see, these are the more specialist species. So if you wanted to encourage scissor bees, then plant lots of daisy species. But those are the slightly more specific ones. So this is sort of a plant list, but not really. It's there are so many lists documenting all of the different plants that are good for butterflies. What I've done here is put together two reviews that two different academic researchers did, and they tallied the number of British butterflies that utilise each of these plants as a nectar resource. So although butterflies don't often feed on don't often feed on nectar. If they do, these are the plants they're going to go for. So the thistles, 47 species of butterfly utilise these for their nectar, and going down the list. But you'll probably notice that some of those are quite wild species. You wouldn't really want them in your garden. Perhaps slightly different with your allotment, but a lot of people I know wouldn't like thistles or even brambles in their garden. But there are species there which look really, really attractive in gardens. Things like wild oregano, knapweed, bird's-foot trefoil, perhaps not ragwort if you live near agricultural land. Red valerian is really common around Lewes. You see it everywhere, but great species. But another species that is a little bit like buddleia, some people sort of consider it a slightly wasteland type plant, but it doesn't matter what other people think. Okay, so this is probably one of the only, or one of the very few controversial topics in wildlife gardening, and that's should you use non-native species. Now, I'm not going to argue that a wildlife garden should only be native, because there's just absolutely no evidence for it whatsoever. The non-native plants that you see, some of them attract more pollinators than any other native species. Now, in a non-urban environment, you might, we prefer non-native species because we're targeting the specialist species, like the Adonis blue, who only target one host plant, and they have evolved in tangent with that species. But in the urban environment, you're not going to get all those very rare specialist species. You're going to get the generalist ones. So, and they don't really mind. As long as there's lots of pollen and nectar in a plant, they really don't care where it's from. And a lot of the species, this is wild marjoram, and it's a really, really nice looking plant, but it's not native. Same as buddleias, lavenders, pot marigold. They're not native species, and they're really, really excellent for pollinators. As part of my research, I didn't say it at the start, but my research includes doing lots of garden surveys, and in Lewes, and the garden with the plant with the highest number of pollinating insects visiting was an orange-ball buddleia tree. It was a pretty large plant, but that's obviously a non-native, but it's really, really great for pollinators. In the case of cultivated species, it's a little bit trickier. If you want to encourage, this is a dahlia, sort of plant that will be visited by bees and butterflies. But if you're in the garden centre and you're going through dahlias, you're most likely to see lots of these. This is a double flower, and you find this on a lot of cultivated species, and those are ones to avoid, because cultivated species, either through intense breeding, have lost their pollen, so they're sterile, and so there's nothing actually for the pollinator to collect. They may still collect nectar from the plant, but quite often they are redundant for pollination. Alternatively, and this is the case for some cultivated foxgloves, that the plant is so hybridized that the flower has changed shape, and the pollen and nectar is actually it's there, but the pollinator can't get to it because the shape is so changed. So I would avoid species that you can tell have not evolved naturally. This is not a natural plant, very attractive, but it's the same as, I'm not going to be kind, but lots of British bedding plants, lots of British annual bedding plants you can see at the centre of the flower there's actually nothing there, it's an empty space. And this means that the reproductive parts of the flower have either been modified into petals, or they've just vanished over time. And these species, again, are redundant for pollinators. But this is a cultivated species of this, which is cranesbill. This is geranium. The cranesbills are the original geraniums, and they are really, really attractive plants. Had one of the highest pollinator counts from my survey and from surveys from other researchers before. Really, really lovely plants, and ideal if you have a shady garden. Okay, so putting together all of the resources that I've mentioned here, I have My approach with wildlife gardening is sort of an offshoot of that, and that's habitat gardening. And that is to use the same methods as we would do in the agricultural or a nature reserve or a national park, whatever it happens to be, and apply that to the garden. So instead of just planting flowers, we plant something that will accommodate a pollinator for its entire life cycle, which includes grasses and it includes other nesting resources. So it's, I'll give you a couple of examples of these. So the first is the meadow habitat. If you have, it doesn't matter the size, if you have space in your garden, the person who's grown this wildflower meadow was particularly effective. She has sort of two wedge-shaped patches in her garden that are taken up by these gorgeous long grass lawns, and she's just left them. She hasn't planted anything, but this lady is particularly lucky because she's right on the edge of agricultural land. She's still in town, but there's lots of seed dispersal over from other parts, from lots of sort of field margins, so she's got probably quite a good dispersion of wildflowers into her seed bank. Somewhere right in the middle of town, if you grew your grass long, you might just find it's one or two species of long grass and it doesn't look particularly effective, but you can supplement this with plug plants or sprinkle some wildflower seeds in. But this is the sort of habitat that in your garden that is great for brown butterflies like the meadow brown or the ringlet, because you can plant it, because they love grasses, they'll use the grass, their caterpillars will feed on the grass, and you can supplement a wildflower meadow like this with species that are not quite, that you wouldn't normally see in a natural, say, chalk grassland. So the purpose here is to create a habitat in your garden that is not the same as a natural version of the habitat, but an altered, artificial, urban version of it, which not only accommodates what you want in the garden, but also increases the species richness of that habitat. So you could plant clovers and knapweeds and yarrow, which is never seen in chalk grassland, but looks really attractive in the garden. This is one I like to do in a garden without wanting to get any produce from any of the vegetables. I just have lots of, let everything go to flower, which I appreciate you won't probably do on your allotment. But at the end of the year, if you have an allotment, a lot of plants that you either haven't noticed, or maybe you didn't need to harvest them, they've bolted, and you get lots of really pretty flowers, which I think look quite attractive as a unique garden feature. And these are the sorts of habitats that attract white butterflies. So your green vein white, or your large or your small white. These are just lists of common host plants that you could have in a little habitat like this. I mean, this only needs, if you wanted this only needs to be a very small space in your garden. It doesn't need to be a huge stretch of it, but it's something a little bit unusual. Briefly about attracting moths. Most adult moths don't have the mouth parts to feed, because their intention is to breed and then they die. But they do sort of quench their thirst on blackberry juice. That's why you quite often see people have left rotting fruits out, maybe from blackberries or whatever it happens to be, for the moths to feed on. But they feed on other species as well. So they'll feed on the nectar of ivy, red valerian, and honeysuckle. And the caterpillars love tree leaves, which is why you see so many insect-eating birds up in trees all the time, because they're probably feeding on a lot of these moth caterpillars. But if you wanted to plant a single plant down in your flower bed and see if you see any moth caterpillars, then bed straws. That's ladies' bed straw, but common bed straw is normally white, very pretty, dainty flower. And if you wanted an elephant hawk moth in your garden, the only thing you need to do is plant swathes of roseberry willow herb, and then you'll get them. Okay, this sort of underlies everything I've talked about. The garden on the flower bed on the left has many different species in it, and this one on the right has two. if a pollinator were to be given the choice, it would choose this one because it's consistent. The foraging, if there were a few species in there that were really good for pollinators, but maybe these ones, I'm not sure what they are, but they're not good for pollinators, I mean, they wouldn't be used, then there's a lot more time invested. It's like us having to sort of search through a whole shop to find what we're looking for, as opposed to it all just being laid out in front of us, the exact thing we want. So if there's a plant that you see in your garden that really attracts pollinators, the very best thing to do is to plant more of it, to have loads of it. Now, I appreciate some people don't have gardens which can accommodate, you know, stretches and stretches of plants like this, but it means if you have a small garden and you want to improve the number, if you want to increase the number of pollinators, the thing to do is decide what kind of garden you want, which is probably already quite clear in your mind, and just increase what you already have. If you have a really large garden, then you could potentially plant a vegetable flower habitat and a meadow habitat in another place, but have more than one. But if you have a small garden, then just plant more of what you already have. And it's really attractive seeing plants like that en masse. Finally, I know I haven't said very much about honeybees. That's purely because my area of research is focused on wild pollinators. And a few people from my garden surveys last year did ask me, or did say, we were thinking of getting some honeybees. I've never kept honeybees, and I don't know a huge amount about their maintenance and looking after them. But I would say that imagine a honeybee is like your dog. It's great. It's a pet that you can keep and you can look after it. But also, if you imagine that the British countryside is full of wolves, it means that there's lots of wild species which really need our help, and they're not and unlike honeybees, they're not getting it from anywhere else. They're relying on the plant choices that we make. So to anybody who's thinking about keeping honeybees, I would suggest have a look what's in your garden already or in your allotment. And although bees travel great distances, remember that ultimately all the pollinators in your green space are competing against each other for the resources. If you introduce a hive of honeybees, which number in the thousands, they will utilise all of the floral resource that they see around them. And a lot of the solitary bees and a lot of the bumblebees, which may have a nest of between 50 and a couple hundred individuals, they'll miss out on that opportunity. So if you have plenty of floral resource, then honeybees are a great idea. But if you have a small garden and are thinking of you just want some more pollinators, I would think about trying to attract more wild pollinators before going along the sort of the domesticated route. Lots of people ask me for recommended lists. These are my recommended lists. So this one you might have seen is a starting guide with a good plant list. The RHS Perfect for Pollinators list is really good for pollen and nectar plants. It doesn't include host plants, so just be aware of that. And Plants for Bees is a new-ish book which is really, really excellent for honeybees, solitary bees and bumblebees, so it will cover all of them. Lastly, I had a few people in my garden surveys last year who volunteered their gardens who said that they would quite like to have some way of keeping up to date with the research, and so I tried a couple of different things, but I have set up a Facebook page which is anybody can join and have a look, and I will just post up pieces of research that I've come across that I think are interesting, news updates and any other sort of identification sort of training opportunities that anybody would like to get involved in over the summer. So if you wanted to, you can have a look at that. I think I'm at the end. And just lastly, your garden is for you. So, put the wildlife as a sort of a second peg in your garden maintenance. Do your garden however you like it. Gardening is inherently wildlife friendly, so no matter what your garden looks like or how you maintain it, it's going to have lots of really good spaces for insects and all sorts of other species. And anything that you choose to do to improve it, do whatever you want to do, but do what you think looks nice, because there are many, many gardens, and if we all do something that looks nice and is good for pollinators, then we're going to make quite a big difference.